Good morning. Good to see you all here. Some of you did not get your ticket to get in this morning. If you did not get one of these, please hold up your hand. Brother Chuck will get one. I know we missed some folks right back over here. Some back over there. I have to tell you the story about the ticket. When you ride the train in India, there is a sign in every bogie. We have some way over here in the cheap seats over on the other side. And the sign says, ticketless passengers shall be ejected from the train. And one time I got on the train, and we were going to another location to do gospel meetings. And when we got, my translator, my helper, who had the tickets, didn't show up. So I'm sitting on the train, and I've got no ticket. And the ticket taker, the TT they call him, comes along, and guess what? I've got no ticket. Now, he could have thrown me off the train, or he could do a lot of paperwork and make me pay about triple, which still was not very much. So he did the paperwork, and he grumbled the whole way through. He was not a happy camper. So I had to pay about triple, which still, again, was not very much. When I got through, I thanked him for not throwing me off the train. So I don't want you thrown off the train this morning. Everybody got one? Okay. It's good to be here with you again. I wish more of you had been here for Bible class, because we talked about some things concerning India that I really can't go back into again. But I want to tell you the greatest mission field in the world is India. And there are many reasons. The uniqueness of that country because of Hinduism and what it teaches in the caste system, and all the people on the bottom of that who are wanting to get out of it, and denominational people who see the discrepancy in what the Bible teaches and what they've been taught. And we have amazing opportunities to reach people with the gospel in this country, most religious people on the planet. And when you have all the social, economic, cultural, religious, other distractions and changes going on, this leads to a place where people really want to know about something that will give them hope. And Hinduism basically is a religion of hopelessness, to be honest. I'd like for you to turn to Luke chapter 10, and that will serve as our text this morning. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a few more things as what has fueled our work. Now, I told you about the great numbers of people from different studies, great numbers of people who are going to be or are leaving Hinduism and denominations, especially Hinduism. And these people are really looking for something better. And it's astounding. I mean, one study, I'll just mention this one very quickly, the Joshua Project, trying to get Bibles into countries in the people's own language that is not predominantly Christian. Those people have said in India that the number of people becoming believers in Christ in that nation since the year 2000 is growing at an exponential rate, and that means you just can't count them. We've been blessed with many, many workers, men we've converted, their children, their sons who are now preaching, in some cases even grandchildren who want to be preachers of the gospel. And we've been at this 40 years, and God has richly blessed our efforts. And together, at least through last year, our team has conducted well over 4.5 million one-day gospel meetings. If you baptize almost 2 per meeting, you know what that means. Over 8.5 million people have rendered obedience to the gospel. Who gets the credit? God does. Every bit of it. In human terms, the Indian brethren do. I'll be honest with you. I've worked hard, but the Indian brethren have been the greatest blessing because they have accepted the responsibility. Now, down in this area, you ought to know who Jack Exum was. Jack was somebody special. He was one of my friends, gave me good advice many times, and Jack came to India twice. And this is what he said. We had this big program teaching hundreds of preachers, some denominational, some members of the church. In 5 languages going on at the same time. Telugu, Tamil, Hindi, Marathi, Kannada. And we had different classes, different teachers. And he said, Ron, you people are doing this the right way. I have never seen a mission work where there was greater delegation of authority by the missionaries and greater acceptance of responsibility on the part of the locals than this work. He said, I went to Ireland. I spent 3 years there. I did everything. I didn't let anybody else do anything. And I went home, and 3 years after I left, the church didn't exist anymore. And Jack was a great man and a great worker, but he told us a great truth. We've got to turn it over to the local brethren. So we believe the 4T formula. Teach them, train them, trust them, turn them loose. And they have accepted the responsibility in a tremendous way. In 2011, we conducted the most one-day, these are one-day gospel meetings that I'm talking about, that we'd ever done, over 200,000. And I was ecstatic because we'd never reached that goal. We baptized, actually, probably the lowest average per meeting forever, like 1.75 per meeting. So that's not, huge numbers as far as the number of people being baptized for each meeting. But I was very happy with what happened. In 2012, we got a call from my secretary. I'm driving back from one of my wife's class reunions, and my secretary is quite a character, and she said, are you sitting down? I said, I hope so, I'm driving. She said, maybe you need to pull off the side of the road. And what ensued was a conversation about how we'd gotten a check from a foundation or trust to the tune of $286,000 plus. That was the one really, really, really big gift that we had looked for, prayed for a long time to get us over the hump. And because of that, the next year, we went from 206,000 meetings to 260,000. And the Lord blessed us again the next year with even bigger gifts. And so we jumped up almost 100,000 meetings in the next year over the previous year, 359,000. And instead of looking at 500,000 people plus being baptized, we're over 700,000. And I thought, thank you, Lord. I know this is not going to happen again. O ye of little faith. The next year, it went to 491,000 meetings. Some of these meetings the Indian brethren are doing on their own. They call them free meetings. And so all these meetings, we baptized 953,000 people. And I prayed that we'd reach 1 million, but we just didn't have the oomph. And I said, okay, the salad days are over. Things will settle back down. I didn't know what I was talking about. The next 3 years, every year we did over 500,000 gospel meetings, and we baptized over 1 million people every year. And last year, 582,000 one-day meetings, and baptized over 1,123,000 souls. That's the power of the gospel among people who are really, really interested, fed up with what they have been taught, looking for something better. You have been a part of that. The last 4 years, the average convert has cost the whopping amount of $3. That's everything we do. Someone comes up and says, Brother Clayton, I want to buy 100 Bibles. Fine, write me a check for $300. We will buy the Bibles, but you've also, both things included, you also have helped 100 people become Christians in the process. So it's all inclusive. And I'm still, frankly, shaking my head. I know God is great. I just needed to learn how great He really is. This just blows my mind. You think this is mind-blowing to you? This goes beyond anything we ever hoped for and expected. So we need your prayers and your help. And I just wanted to share that last little bit of information. And Chuck's right. There's so many things that happen that we don't have time to discuss, just crazy things. Should I tell them about the loose jackets? I'm going to tell you one. Here's a cultural difference. When I went to India, I found out, Chuck, you've got a few more customers. Loose jackets I wanted some tangerines. And someone said, what are you talking about? I said, loose jacket, tangerine. Oh, brother, those are loose jackets. Oh, okay, so I thought a loose jacket was a tangerine. Years later, I went down to Markapur, where everything happens, and talked to Brother Abel, the chief man there, our main guy, and I said, Abel, I want you to go buy me 12 loose jackets and put them in the freezer. I did not elaborate beyond that. He looked at me and said, brother, and I said, you heard me, I want 12 loose jackets, just put them in my freezer. I came back that night, and I opened up my freezer anticipating some good frozen tangerines to then peel off and let them thaw out a little bit and eat them just as cold as I could. Love that. And instead, I've got all this cloth in there, and I start pulling out cloth. What in the world? And it turns out that a jacket there means a sari top for a woman. It's a top she wears when she wears a sari. And he had gone and found a large woman, and he had gotten 12 large, loose jackets, because a jacket is a sari top. And I still remind him of that, and he still blushes every time we talk about it. So that's one of those little things that happens. In Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 25. Now I'm going to paraphrase some of this. Here's a lawyer. He comes to Jesus, puts him to the test. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? What do I have to do to be saved? And Jesus said, what's written in the law? How do you read it? How does it read to you? And he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, you've answered correctly. Now you do that and you're going to live. And he says, yeah, but he's wanting to justify himself. He's a lawyer after all. And he said, okay, but who's my neighbor? Now let's look at this just a second. This man knew the law exactly right, because this is not one passage in the Bible. This is two from the Old Testament. One is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And a second like it unto that is what? Love your neighbor as yourself. And that's found in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 10. And so he has gotten it exactly right, and exactly right from the fact that he was such a good student that he had gone to the Old Testament, found one in one passage, found one in the other, and said, this is it. Here's your answer. And that's what Jesus later would say, this is the foundation of the law and the prophets. Well, so we put them together. So who's my neighbor? And Jesus began to teach the parable that we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here's a man on his way coming down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He was accosted by robbers. They beat him half to death. They stripped him of all his clothing. They took everything the man had and threw him on the side of the road or in a ditch to die. Now, when Jesus taught a parable, unless he says it's some other kind of people, they're always Jews. Because he was a Jew, he lived under the Jewish law, and he lived among Jewish people. But in this case, this is a Jew. And here comes a priest walking down the road. And he sees him in the ditch or the side of the road. And he's a Levite, but also he's a priest. You had to be a Levite to be a priest. And so not all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. And so he sees him, and that's a man who's his brother in the faith, a brother in the flesh, a brother in Abraham. Ethnically speaking, he is his kin. He's a brother in Adam. But he chooses to go to the other side and pretend he doesn't see him and ignores him. Here comes a Levite. And this is the priestly tribe, and he sees this man who's his brother in the faith and in the flesh, and a brother in Abraham, and a brother who in Adam, and all of that, and he goes to the other side of the road, pretends he doesn't see him. And then the third man that came along was a Samaritan. He's the one who stops to help. He very carefully, tenderly pours oil on his wounds and binds them up. And he puts some clothes on him, and he puts him on his own donkey. That means now he's got to walk. This guy is all kinds of trouble for him. Puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn. He takes care of him all that day. And then he goes to the innkeeper and says, I want you to take care of him now. And if I owe you anything else when I come back, here's some money, take care of it. If I owe you anything else, I'll pay you when I come back. And that's what he did. And that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. But you know, we've said a Good Samaritan is someone who stops and renders aid to someone who needs help. That's only part of the truth. And that's not the real lesson. The real lesson is that the Samaritan knew in his heart that that man who was a Jew would never stop and waste his time or touch a man who is an untouchable to him to help him. That's the real lesson. In other words, if the roles were reversed, he knew that that Jewish man who's dying on the side of the road would never have stopped to help a Samaritan. I mean, if you can't get Jews to stop and help Jews, they're sure not going to help a Samaritan because of their view of the Samaritans. Samaritans were outcast to the Jewish people. They were outcast because they were in-betweeners. They were half-breed Jews. They were Assyrians who had attacked their land, had intermarried, taken over and intermarried with these people, so they left their faith. Some people would say they prostituted their faith and became something less than what a Jew should be. And if you could not prove your family lineage back at least 7 generations, you weren't a Jew. So this man stopped and rendered aid when he knew in his heart that man would never stop to help him. Or the other application would be someone who would not be able to pay you back. And that's what he did. And so when Jesus talked to him, this man knew, this lawyer knew he's talking about a half-breed. Now, here's what you've got. They were treated like outcasts by the Jews. They were treated like dogs. I don't mean like a pet. I mean like a nuisance, like a cur, like a diseased dog that needs to be put away. This is one of the problems we face in India is all the street dogs. Nobody owns them, but the government won't really take care of them in the sense of getting rid of them. It's a real problem. Years ago, we read every day just in the city of Hyderabad, 400 people were being bitten by these dogs and had to start shots to prevent them dying from rabies, just in case. That's a lot of people. The government reached a point they don't have any more medicine to give away free. You've got to go to a private clinic and do that. The Indian government has partly socialized medicine, but it also has, you have the right to go to any private physician you want to. So it's a mixture. Well, so they despise these people. And this reminds me of some stories in the Bible about Samaritans. Here's the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan. The apostles went into the city. They kind of had to hold their nose when they went to buy food because they're dealing with Samaritans, and they didn't like that. And so they came back, and Jesus is engaged in a conversation with this woman, and he had committed 2 social faux pas. Didn't sin, but socially this was not really acceptable. You know that in many countries in the world it's still not acceptable for a man to talk to a woman unless they've been properly introduced. And I mean in formal society, and that's true in India. And it was then. And the second thing is, he's talking to a woman who's a Samaritan. And doesn't know this woman talking to her. She's a Samaritan. This is really a no-no. And Jesus is talking to her, and the conversation starts out, she's curious, and then it grows to the point that she says, "Sir, I perceive you're a prophet." And then it goes from that point, and she says, "I believe that you're the Messiah." And she again goes into her city and tells everybody, "Come meet a man that has told me everything I've ever done." Well, he didn't, but what he did tell her was this. She said something about my husband, and he says, "The man you're living with now is not your husband. You've had 4 husbands, but the man you're talking to now or living with now is not your husband. He knows everything about me." She went and told people. They came out to meet him. They wanted to know, who is this man? "I perceive that you are the Messiah." And she was right. And here come the other apostles, and they said, "Where did he get any food?" He said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." And then that great verse, "Do you not say there yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that they're white already unto harvest, ready for the picking. So Jesus was talking to an untouchable. And she says something else that's important. Your people say that we should worship God, you should worship God in the temple in Jerusalem. Our people say that we worship here in this mountain. Why did they worship on the mountain? Because they were untouchable. They could not go to the temple. They could not worship there. They would be thrown out. And if they did get in, they would have to do a temple cleansing ceremony. And that's what the Hindus do today. They borrowed a lot of stuff from Judaism. If an untouchable goes into a Hindu temple where he's not supposed to go, even if he's a Hindu, guess what happens? They throw him out, they may beat him, and they have to cleanse the temple because he has polluted it spiritually. Now that's their thinking. So we have those things, and Jesus said, the truth is that today is coming when all those who worship God must worship in spirit and truth, and it doesn't matter where you are, in this mountain or anywhere else. Did you know there's still Samaritans today that worship the same way these people did 2,000 years ago? I was surprised to find that out, but they do up in the mountains. And they're not Jews because they came from that lineage where they can never be a Jew. So this is a little background about the untouchability of this man and what he did. And Jesus made a statement here. Why did he stop to help this man? If you look at verse 33, but a certain Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion. Now, I'm convinced of something. I'm convinced that Jesus was the greatest man who ever lived. And we have studied so many of his great qualities, his love, his forgiveness, his teaching, his ability to deal with people, his insightfulness with people, so many different things. And the one thing I think we don't talk nearly enough about is his compassion. Jesus had a heart of butter, and anybody that had a hard luck story, his heart just melted. So many people around him. Here's another thing I've learned over the last few years. Everywhere Jesus went, there was a big crowd, and I mean it was not always very, it was always unruly. People wanted to touch him. He was a hero. They wanted to be healed by him. They wanted to hear him preach and teach. They wanted to see him. I mean, he's a celebrity. Look, there's Jesus. I touched Jesus. It was a big deal. He was a big deal. Everybody loved him except the Pharisees. I was in India, and we got on the plane, and I'm sitting next to my wife on the plane, and here comes this man, and I said, is that who I think? No, that couldn't be him. I said, yes, it is. And he came and he sat right next to me. And this is what I tell the Indian brethren. I said, he didn't sit next to you. My point was Jesus made people feel very special just to be around him. He didn't sit next to you. He sat next to me. That made me a big shot, in my own mind. And I said, do you know who it was? And they breathlessly waiting. And I say, Kapil Dev. Now, he was one of the greatest cricket stars ever in India. They called him the greatest all-rounder. He could do everything in the game very, very well. Well, they were envious, see, but I got to sit next to Dev, and they did not. That made me feel special for a little while. Jesus made everybody feel special. And that's why they wanted to be around him. And when one woman touched him, didn't even touch him, just touched his garment. She was healed like that. Jesus was special. And he was a man of compassion. When his good friend Lazarus died, Jesus deliberately did not go in time to heal him. Deliberately. He put that off. He put it off so he knew that Lazarus was dead, because he had plans all along to raise him from the dead as a testimony to the fact that God is all-powerful and that Jesus is his son. That was the whole purpose of miracles. And so he goes there, and Mary and Martha both at different times say the same thing to him. And it tore out his heart. Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. How do you think that hit him? And then the other would come and says the same thing. Master, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. People say, I can quote Scripture, and they quote John 11:35, and they think it's funny. Jesus wept. It's not funny. It may be that that 2-word verse says more about the compassion of Jesus than we might imagine. Jesus wept, and then he did raise Lazarus from the dead. The sister said, Master, it's not going to do any good. He's been dead 4 days. He already stinks. He raised him from the dead. And so he had compassion. So who was the good neighbor? The lawyer in verse 36 had the right answer. The man who stopped to help. That's the real neighbor. And Jesus said, you go and do the same. You go and do likewise. You want to be the kind of neighbor you need to be, that's what you need to do. And so, we're to do the same thing today. And I want to tell you, as churches of Christ, we've done a pretty good job. And I want to congratulate you. You probably have been involved in every one of these things. In the early 1980s, just as I was beginning my work in India, the people of Ethiopia were literally starving to death. 50 people died every hour from starvation. We sent money and food and more food and clothing and more food and medicine and more food and bedding and more food and more food and more food. But the problem is, your body, when you're starving to death, will reach a point that your organs start shutting down, and I don't care how much food you shove down your gullet, you're not going to make it. You're going to die. Anybody remember Karen Carpenter, the singer? That's exactly what happened with her. She thought she was fat. She was bulimic. She got to such a point it didn't matter. It was too late. And she died. And it was one of the greatest tragedies. Preventable. And so that was what was going on in Ethiopia. And it wasn't long after that the people in Poland were starving. And it was still the Iron Curtain. They were still communists. Those people were dominated by communism. And what did the churches of Christ do? What did we do? We, in 13 weeks, sent $7.5 million to Poland to help feed those people who were starving to death. What does communism mean? Remember this when you vote for anybody. A communist is an atheist. I don't care what they claim to be otherwise. That's what communism is. These people were atheists. They saw what churches of Christ were doing. Do you know what the Communist Party of Poland did? They declared the Church of Christ an official religion of Poland. Can you believe that? Because we did so much good. And later, of course, we know the Iron Curtain fell, thankfully. But that's the kind of reputation we got. And then we can think about other things that happened. Katrina, one of the worst natural disasters we've ever had. And we were there with food and money and blankets and clothing and medicine and more food and more money and helping rebuild church buildings and houses and everything else. My oldest son, Jeff, his oldest son, my oldest grandson, Paige, went down there to the New Orleans area, and they were helping to rebuild houses, and they helped to rebuild one church building where Karen and I went a few years later and talked about the work in India, and they showed us where the damage was, and I said my son was here to help. My grandson was here to help. And then we've had other terrible things like Haiti and the horrible tsunami in Japan and the tsunami that hit India and Indonesia and so many other places later, and we've always responded in a great way. Our work alone took in $600,000, and we spent every bit of that to help people in India during the tsunami. And a tsunami is an undersea earthquake. And when those waves first come up, I don't know how this is possible, but I've read it too many times from experts. It's going 500 miles an hour. And the waves build up and it slows down. Can you imagine? And the water goes way back, and everybody thinks, what's happening? They go out and start picking up fish and everything, and all of a sudden here comes this wall of water 10 to 12 feet high, and all those people are gone. They're history. That water hits them with such force, the force alone might kill them, but it takes them out to sea and they drown. And it goes back out again, and here it comes the second time, and now it's 20 to 25 feet high. And so it goes a lot further inland. And the third time it comes in, it's just a surge about 30 feet high, and it just finally settles down. People in India, in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at an Air Force base, went up to the third story of a building to try to stay away from it, and the water was so high, it flooded that. Everybody, every single person on that Air Force base died. Every one of them. Islands were washed off the map, entire populations of some of those islands in that chain of islands. So it's a horrible thing. 250,000 people died just in Indonesia. That doesn't count the rest of the world. It was probably 500,000, at least 40,000 in India. And every week in India, there is a tsunami, not physically, but the same effect as what we saw in Indonesia. 250,000 people die. And many of them die without ever hearing the gospel. Many of these people are not prepared to meet God. And that's the tragedy. That's the reality. Did you know every day in India, 76,000 babies are born? Every day in India, I think it's 29,000 plus people die. They still have a net increase, but the thing is, 76,000 precious babies. And so that's what we're dealing with. What should it profit a man if he should gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for himself? There's nothing you can give. See, this is why our work, your work here, I don't care how small a congregation, how big it is. All of us need to understand the importance, the role we play in God's kingdom to get the gospel to other people. All of you can do something. You can write notes. You can write letters. You can make phone calls. You can send email messages, whatever, and encourage others to come to services, to study the Bible with Chuck or somebody else in this congregation. It's so important because a soul is worth more than everything in this world, not just what you may think, but everything in this world. And so if you just win one, that's a lot. Jesus came to seek and to save that which is lost. Now, I want to tell you one more thing about what we're doing. We're not just about evangelism. We have 4 different main sections of our ministry. Evangelism, preacher training, follow-up work. And some of that comes through the first 2. And the last thing is benevolence. And one thing that we do that's very important to me is helping Christian widows whose husbands were preachers. We can't help them all. Do you know that India has more widows than anybody in the world? Most widows never remarry. I think that's a great tragedy. But that's Indian stuff. And a lot of Indian stuff started out as Hindu stuff, and it just become Indian. Well, here's a preacher, and he's in a village, and he owns property, and he's going to build a little hut. I do not mean a house like you live in. I don't care how poor your house is. You have no idea what a hut is in India. It may be just 1 room, maybe 2. And it's nothing like yours, nothing like mine. We have been very blessed in this country for the houses that we're able to live in. You say, I live in an apartment. Doesn't matter. It's still better than what they're living. And then he either attaches a church building to it or builds a church building very close to it. And he gets the members of the church to give as much as they can to help fund that. The problem is we're dealing with the poorest of the poor. A woman can work in the fields as a widow, agricultural work, and get 50 cents a day, not an hour, to $2 a day tops, depending on how good she is and what the crop is. 50 cents a day. So the husband who's borrowed this money, and the note is in his name, not the church's name, guess what happens? When he dies, then the widow is stuck with a big bill. How's she going to pay for that? The first time this came to me, one of our key men, one of our leaders said, Brother Ron, I want you to know something. This brother was a good worker, one of my best workers, and he had kidney failure, and they did everything they could to save him. His wife took him to doctor after doctor, and he died. And she owes, and it was the equivalent of $2,300 back then. And he says she has no way to pay it back. And she has 6 children at home. So I thought, what if that had been Karen? What if that had been my mom? I'd want somebody to help them get out of debt. And you know, to that woman, that's about like $230,000 without insurance. That's about what it would be the equivalent. And she was going to lose her house. The church was going to lose the building because she couldn't pay it back. We've got to help her. So I put something in the newsletter. And a Christian widow in Texas sent me a check. You help that woman, get her out of debt, keep her house, $3,000. So we paid that one off, and we had another one that owed right at $700 in U.S., and we paid hers off. And so for $3,000, that good Christian widow helped 2 ladies get out of debt, keep their house, keep the church building, because they're tied together almost every single time. And since that time, in the past 5 years, we have helped over 400 widows keep their houses and the church to keep their buildings. And if we had not done that, with God's grace and by people like you helping, they would have lost both. So that's one of our big pushes. I still have over 100 widows on my list who really need the help. Some of them not much money, some quite a bit. And we're going to do everything we can by the grace of God to get them out of debt. And we don't want the church to lose their building, because I'm going to tell you what happens. See, the preacher's paying the interest every month. As long as he's paying the interest, they're happy. But when he dies, she didn't have the money to pay the interest, and so they want all their money then. And they'll come to the house, and they'll lock her out. They'll put another lock on the door. They'll put another lock on the church building. They can't use the church building. They come and slap her around. They use filthy language with her. They do all kinds of threatening things. And if eventually she can't come up with the money, they drag her to court and they get all the property. That's what happens. We'd like to put a stop to that. And I've told the men that work with me, the one in particular who goes to take care of this, because he's very thorough. He's my right arm in India. His name is Ghana. Pray for Ghana and his good health and safety. I said, Ghana, I want you to tell these men, after all the paperwork's done, that they've written on there, this is paid on the promissory note, and sign it and date it and all that. I said, I want you to tell that man, if he's been mean to this woman, that my boss has told me to tell you that God has a very special place in hell for people like you. And I believe he does. Look at what Jesus said about those who do what they can to steal widows' houses. So, this is what we're doing in part. God has blessed us richly. It takes a lot of money to do what we do. I mean, a lot of money. And we know that. And folks like you have really been gracious to us and help us to reach the goals that we have. After we get the invitation song and communion, I want to tell you how you can help if you will. You've been a great audience. We appreciate so much this opportunity. If you are not a Christian, you need to be one. You need to not only believe in Jesus as the Son of God, but you need to turn from your sins through repentance. And you need to make a confession that Jesus indeed is the Christ, the Son of God. And you must be baptized, because in baptism we come in contact with the blood of Christ. That's what saves us. It's not baptism per se, it's the blood of Christ, but that's where we reach the blood of Christ. Paul said in Romans chapter 6 and verse 3, don't you know that if you've been baptized into Christ, you've been baptized into His death? And that's where He shed His blood. So this morning, if you're needing to respond to the invitation, you come. While together we stand and while we sing.